Hi, I'm Sarah, and yes, my parents literally burned a $45 million inheritance check right in front of me on Christmas morning, thinking they were teaching me a lesson about greed and entitlement. What they didn't know was that the check they destroyed was just a decoy, and I had the real will hidden where they'd never think to look. They thought they'd crushed my dreams and secured my brother's future, but what they actually did was hand me the evidence I needed to expose 20 years of manipulation and favoritism that had nearly destroyed my relationship with the one person who truly believed in me, my grandmother Margaret. Stay with me, because this story gets wild. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. It started 3 days before Christmas when I received an overnight package at my small apartment in downtown Austin. I'd been working as a freelance graphic designer, barely making ends meet while my parents constantly reminded me how successful my older brother Michael had become as a corporate lawyer. The return address made my heart skip a beat: Henderson and Associates, Estate Planning. Inside was a letter that would change everything, along with what appeared to be a cashier's check for an amount so large I had to count the zeros twice. $45 million. The letter was from Margaret's attorney, explaining that my grandmother had passed away 2 weeks earlier and had left me her entire estate, including the family ranch in the hill country and the mineral rights that had recently proven to contain a significant oil deposit. I'd known Grandma Margaret owned some land, but I had no idea about the oil or that she'd been quietly accumulating wealth for decades. The letter went on to explain that Margaret had been very specific about her wishes: everything was to go to me, not to be shared with the rest of the family, because I was the only one who had maintained a genuine relationship with her over the years. My hands shook as I read and reread the document. Margaret had been the one constant source of love and support in my life. While my parents had always favored Michael, praising his achievements and overlooking mine, Margaret had seen something in me that others missed. She'd encouraged my artistic pursuits when my parents called them impractical. She'd listened to my dreams when everyone else dismissed them as unrealistic. She'd been the one person who made me feel valuable and worthy of love. The timing was particularly painful because I'd only learned about her death through a brief, cold phone call from my mother 3 days after the funeral. They hadn't even told me she was sick. When I'd asked why I wasn't informed or invited to the service, my mother had curtly explained that it was a small family gathering and they hadn't wanted to burden me with travel expenses I couldn't afford. The cruelty of being excluded from saying goodbye to the most important person in my life had left me devastated and furious. Now, staring at this inheritance, I understood why they'd kept me away. They must have assumed Margaret would leave everything to them or split it among the family. They'd probably spent the funeral planning how to divide her assets, never imagining that the granddaughter they'd always treated as an afterthought would inherit everything. I spent the next 2 days in a state of shock, researching the attorney's credentials and verifying the authenticity of the documents. Everything checked out. The oil discovery on Margaret's land had been confirmed just months before her death, transforming what had been a modest ranch into one of the most valuable properties in Texas. The mineral rights alone were worth tens of millions, and the monthly royalty payments would be enough to support me for life. But there was something else in the package that puzzled me: a second letter, handwritten by Margaret herself, sealed and marked, personal and confidential. Inside, she'd written something that made my blood run cold. "Sarah, my darling, I know your parents will try to contest this will and convince you that you don't deserve this inheritance. I've taken precautions to protect your interests, but you must be prepared for them to fight you. They've never understood your worth, but I do. This money comes with a responsibility. Use it not just to secure your future, but to build something meaningful. Don't let their jealousy and manipulation destroy what we've built together. I love you more than words can express." The warning proved prophetic. On December 23rd, my phone rang. It was my mother, Linda, and her tone was unlike anything I'd ever heard from her before. There was a forced sweetness that immediately put me on guard. "Sarah, honey, we need to talk. Your father and I have been thinking, and we realize we haven't been as close as we should be lately. Why don't you come for Christmas dinner? It would mean so much to have the whole family together." I was suspicious immediately. My parents hadn't invited me for a major holiday in 3 years, always claiming they were keeping it small or that Michael's schedule was too complicated to coordinate with mine. The sudden inclusion felt calculated, especially coming so soon after the inheritance paperwork had arrived. "That's very kind of you, Mom, but I don't want to impose. I know how busy everyone gets during the holidays." "Nonsense," she insisted, her voice taking on that edge I remembered from childhood when she was determined to get her way. "Family is everything, Sarah. Besides, we have some important things to discuss. About Margaret's estate." There it was. They knew about the inheritance, which meant they'd either been in contact with the attorney or had somehow intercepted information about the will. My stomach dropped as I realized they'd probably spent the last few days strategizing about how to handle me, how to convince me to share or surrender what Margaret had left me. "I'll think about it," I said carefully. "Sarah." My father's voice came on the line, stern and authoritative in the way that had intimidated me throughout my childhood. "Your mother is being polite, but I'll be direct. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. We know about the will, and we know about the oil money. We need to discuss this as a family, and we need to do it before any hasty decisions are made." The threat was barely veiled. They weren't inviting me for Christmas dinner, they were summoning me for a confrontation. But something had changed in me since receiving that inheritance. Maybe it was finally having tangible proof of Margaret's love and faith in me, or maybe it was the financial security that allowed me to stand up to them. For the first time in my life, instead of feeling the familiar anxiety that usually accompanied my father's disapproval, I felt a strange calm. "I'll be there," I said simply, and hung up before they could say anything else. I spent Christmas Eve preparing for what I knew would be the most important conversation of my life. I made copies of all the legal documents and stored them in multiple, secure locations. I researched my rights as a beneficiary and familiarized myself with Texas inheritance law. Most importantly, I called the attorney's office and left a detailed message explaining my concerns about potential family interference and requesting that all original documents be secured in their vault. But then I had an idea that felt both inspired and slightly reckless. If my parents were planning to ambush me about the inheritance, I wanted to understand exactly what they were thinking and planning. So I made a decision that would prove to be crucial. I had a duplicate cashier's check made, identical to the real one but drawn from a different account with minimal funds. The real check, along with all the original documents, went into a safety deposit box I opened that afternoon. The fake check would be my test, my way of seeing how far my parents were willing to go. Christmas morning arrived gray and cold, matching my mood as I drove to my childhood home in the suburbs. The house looked exactly the same as it had throughout my youth: perfectly manicured lawn, expensive decorations arranged with mathematical precision, everything designed to project success and respectability to the neighbors. It had never felt like home to me, more like a museum where I was always afraid of breaking something or leaving a mark. Michael's Mercedes was already in the driveway, along with a BMW I didn't recognize. As I walked to the front door, I could hear voices inside, animated conversation that stopped abruptly when I rang the doorbell. My mother answered, dressed in an outfit that probably cost more than I'd made in the past 3 months, her smile tight and forced. "Sarah, sweetheart. You look wonderful. Come in, come in." The living room had been arranged like a courtroom, with my parents and Michael sitting on one side and a single chair positioned opposite them. The unknown BMW belonged to a man in an expensive suit who introduced himself as Richard Walsh, the family's attorney. I'd never heard of him before, but his presence made it clear that this wasn't going to be a casual conversation about holiday plans. "Sarah," my father began, his voice taking on the patronizing tone he'd always used when he thought I was being unreasonable, "we need to discuss this situation with Margaret's will. Now, I know you think you've inherited something significant, but there are complications you don't understand." Michael leaned forward, his expression concerned but condescending. "The thing is, sis, Margaret wasn't in her right mind toward the end. We have medical records showing she was suffering from early-stage dementia. Any will she signed in the last 2 years could be successfully challenged in court." I felt a flash of rage at the casual cruelty of their lie. Margaret had been sharp as a tack until the day she died, sharper than any of them. But I kept my expression neutral, curious to see how far they would push this fiction. "That's not true," I said simply. "I spoke with her just weeks before she passed. She was completely lucid." Richard Walsh cleared his throat and opened a briefcase filled with official-looking documents. "Miss Thompson, while I understand your emotional attachment to your grandmother, we have a responsibility to protect the family's interests. Mrs. Margaret Thompson was indeed suffering from cognitive decline, and the will that supposedly leaves you her entire estate was executed during a period when she lacked the mental capacity to make such decisions. What are you suggesting?" I asked, though I already knew exactly where this was heading. My mother's voice took on that syrupy tone she'd always used when she wanted something. "Sweetheart, we're suggesting that the right thing to do, the fair thing, would be to voluntarily relinquish any claim to Margaret's estate. The property should remain in the family, managed responsibly by people who understand business and investment. By people like Michael," my father added, not even bothering to hide his preference. "He has the education and experience to handle this kind of responsibility." I looked at my brother, this golden child who had never shown the slightest interest in Margaret or her ranch, who had visited her exactly twice in the past 5 years and both times had spent the entire visit checking his phone and complaining about the lack of cell service. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. And what if I don't agree? I asked. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. My father's face hardened into the expression I remembered from childhood, the one that had made me feel small and worthless so many times. Then we'll contest the will in court, he said bluntly. We'll drag out the proceedings for years, cost you hundreds of thousands in legal fees, and ultimately prove that Margaret was incompetent when she signed that document. You'll end up with nothing except debt and a reputation as someone who tried to steal from her own family. Michael nodded gravely, playing his role as the reasonable sibling. Sarah, think about this practically. Even if you somehow won in court, do you really want to destroy the family over money? Do you want to be responsible for tearing us apart? The manipulation was so familiar, so practiced, that I almost admired their skill. They'd spent my entire life convincing me that my needs and wants were less important than maintaining family harmony, that standing up for myself was selfish and destructive. They'd trained me to believe that I should be grateful for whatever scraps of attention and affection they threw my way, and that asking for more was greedy and ungrateful. But sitting there, listening to them casually discuss stealing my inheritance and destroying Margaret's final wishes, I felt something crystallize inside me. This wasn't about money, not really. This was about a lifetime of being dismissed, overlooked, and treated as less valuable than my brother. This was about them erasing the one person who had truly loved and believed in me. I reached into my purse and pulled out the duplicate check, the fake one I'd prepared as a test. I placed it on the coffee table where everyone could see it, watching. Their eyes widened as they processed the amount. This is what Margaret left me, I said quietly. $45 million, plus the ranch and mineral rights. The silence that followed was deafening. I could see the calculations happening behind their eyes, the rapid mental math of greed and entitlement. This was more money than they'd imagined, more than enough to transform not just my life but the entire family's financial future. Richard Walsh was the first to speak, his voice carefully controlled. Miss Thompson, I strongly advise you not to deposit or cash that check until the will's validity has been properly established. Any attempt to access those funds could be construed as fraud if the will is later invalidated. My mother leaned forward, her mask slipping slightly to reveal the desperation underneath. Sarah, honey, you have to understand, this is an enormous responsibility. This kind of money, this kind of property, it requires expertise to manage properly. You don't have the background or experience to handle something this complex. What your mother is saying, my father added, his voice taking on that lecturing tone I'd heard 1,000 times, is that Margaret, bless her heart, didn't understand the burden she was placing on you. She thought she was being generous, but she was actually setting you up for failure. I stood up slowly, the check still lying on the table between us. So what exactly are you proposing? Michael exchanged a look with our parents before speaking. We think the fair thing would be for you to sign over your claim to the estate. In return, we'd make sure you're taken care of. Maybe a trust fund? Something that would give you a comfortable income without the stress of managing all that wealth. How much? I asked. Another exchange of glances. My father cleared his throat. We were thinking $50,000 a year. That's more than you're making now, and it would be guaranteed for life. $50,000 a year out of an inheritance worth $45 million, plus ongoing oil royalties that would likely generate millions annually. They were literally offering me pennies while planning to keep the rest for themselves, and they expected me to be grateful for their generosity. And if I refuse? My mother's expression hardened, the pretense of maternal concern evaporating. Then you'll force us to take legal action. We don't want to do that, Sarah, but we will if we have to. We'll prove that Margaret was incompetent. And we'll make sure everyone knows that you tried to take advantage of a sick old woman. The threat hung in the air like smoke. They weren't just planning to steal my inheritance. They were prepared to destroy my reputation and relationship with Margaret's memory in the process. The casual cruelty of it took my breath away. I looked around the room at these people who were supposed to love and support me, who had instead spent my entire life making me feel inadequate and unwanted. I thought about Margaret, who had seen something valuable in me when no one else would. I thought about the letter she'd left, warning me that this moment would come and trusting me to be strong enough to handle it. Then I did something that shocked everyone in the room, including myself. I picked up the check, held it up so they could all see it clearly, and tore it in half. Sarah, no. My mother lunged forward, but I was already tearing the pieces into smaller fragments. What are you doing? Michael demanded, his voice cracking with panic. I let the pieces fall onto the coffee table like confetti, watching the expressions of horror and disbelief on their faces. "I'm making this simple for everyone," I said calmly. "No inheritance, no legal battle, no family drama. Problem solved." But my father wasn't buying it. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. "That was too easy. You're not the type to just give up on something this big." He was right, of course. But I needed them to believe they'd won, needed them to think they'd successfully bullied me into submission one more time. I forced my voice to shake slightly, injected just enough defeat and resignation to make it believable. "You're right, Dad. I can't fight all of you. I don't have the money for lawyers or the energy for a court battle. I just want this to be over." My mother's expression softened with what she probably thought was sympathy but looked more like satisfied condescension. "Oh, sweetheart, you're doing the right thing. This kind of money would have ruined your life anyway. You're much better off without that burden." Michael nodded sagely, already mentally spending his share of the inheritance. "This is for the best, Sarah. You'll see that in time." Richard Walsh was gathering up the pieces of the torn check, probably planning to see if it could be reconstructed and verified. "Miss Thompson, I'll need you to sign some documents formally renouncing your claim to the estate." "Of course," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Whatever you need." As I signed the papers they'd prepared, I caught my reflection in the mirror hanging above the fireplace. I looked defeated, broken, exactly the way they expected me to look. But behind my eyes, I could see something they'd never recognize, the quiet satisfaction of someone who had just played the perfect long game. They had no idea what was coming. The weeks following Christmas passed in a haze of false normalcy. My family believed they'd successfully neutralized the threat to their plans, and I let them maintain that illusion while I quietly began the most important investigation of my life. The torn check pieces had been carefully preserved by Richard Walsh, who'd apparently managed to reconstruct enough of it to verify the account information. What he didn't know was that the account contained exactly $47.32, the minimum balance required to keep it open. Meanwhile, the Real inheritance sat safely in a vault downtown, waiting for the right moment to resurface. But I knew I couldn't simply waltz back into their lives waving the authentic documents. If I'd learned anything from my family's Christmas ambush, it was that they'd been planning this takeover for much longer than I'd initially realized. I needed to understand the full scope of their deception before I could effectively counter it. My first discovery came 3 days after New Year's, when I visited Margaret's ranch for what I told myself would be a final goodbye. The property was supposed to be sealed pending the resolution of the estate, but I still had the key Margaret had given me years earlier when she'd started asking me to check on things during her occasional trips to visit her sister in Dallas. The moment I pulled up the familiar gravel driveway, I knew something was wrong. There were tire tracks everywhere, multiple vehicles that had clearly been coming and going for weeks. The front porch, which Margaret had always kept meticulously clean, was littered with cigarette butts and coffee cups. Someone had been treating the property like their personal headquarters, and I had a sinking feeling I knew exactly who. I let myself in through the back door, the same way I'd entered countless times during my childhood visits with Margaret. The house felt violated, ransacked in a way that went beyond simple searching. Drawers had been pulled out and emptied, closets torn apart, floorboards pried up in several rooms. They'd been looking for something specific, something they believed Margaret had hidden in the house. In the kitchen, I found evidence of recent occupation, fresh food in the refrigerator, dirty dishes in the sink, a cell phone charger plugged into the wall outlet. On the counter was a yellow legal pad covered with Michael's distinctive handwriting, notes that made my blood boil as I read them. Oil survey maps, check basement storage, bank safety deposit box key, look-in jewelry box, original will, probably hidden in study, property deed locations, check filing cabinet. Below that, in my father's handwriting, Sarah seemed too calm. Need to make sure she doesn't have copies. They'd been systematically searching Margaret's home for weeks, looking for the very documents I'd already secured. More disturbing was the clear indication that they suspected I might not have been completely honest about surrendering my claim. They knew me better than I'd given them credit for, understood that my quick capitulation had been out of character. I photographed every page of notes with my phone, then continued exploring the house. In Margaret's study, I found more evidence of their extensive search. Her desk had been completely dismantled, the secret compartment where she used to hide my birthday money when I was young had been discovered and emptied. Her personal papers were scattered across the floor, family photos dumped carelessly in corners. But it was what I found in her bedroom that truly shattered me. They'd destroyed her jewelry box, the antique wooden chest that had belonged to her own grandmother. The delicate inlay work was cracked, the tiny ballerina figure that had danced to Fur Elise was broken off its spring. This wasn't just searching, this was desecration. They'd torn apart the physical memory of a woman who'd loved them, looking for treasure like pirates ransacking a ship. Among the debris, I found something that stopped me cold, a manila envelope with my name written on it in Margaret's careful script. Inside were photocopies of bank statements going back 5 years, showing regular deposits from something called Hartwell Energy Consortium. The amounts were staggering, monthly payments of $300,000, sometimes more. Margaret hadn't just discovered oil on her land. She'd been receiving massive royalty payments for years and hiding the extent of her wealth from the family. But there was more. Clipped to the bank statements was a handwritten note. "Sarah, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone and they're already searching. I've been documenting their behavior for years, recording conversations, saving emails. They've been planning to contest any will that doesn't favor them since my first cancer diagnosis 3 years ago. The evidence is in the place we used to hide from your mother's lectures. You'll know where I mean. Use it wisely." I knew exactly what she meant. When I was 12 and would visit during the summer, Margaret and I had discovered a loose stone in the basement wall behind her old oil furnace. We'd turned it into our secret hiding place, somewhere to stash notes and small treasures away from my mother's disapproving eyes during family visits. Linda had always lectured Margaret about spoiling me, criticizing every gift or special treat as undermining proper discipline. The basement felt different now, colder and somehow smaller than I remembered. But the furnace was still there, ancient and hulking in the corner. I felt along the stone wall until I found the familiar loose block, exactly where it had been 20 years earlier. Inside the hidden cavity was a metal box I'd never seen before, secured with a combination lock. I tried Margaret's birthday, then mine, then the date we'd first discovered this hiding place. Nothing worked. Frustrated and running out of ideas, I noticed something scratched into the metal of the box itself, our song. Margaret and I had shared a special connection through music. She'd taught me to play piano during those long summer visits, and we'd always had one piece that was uniquely ours. Claire de Lune. We'd played it together dozens of times, her weathered hands guiding my small fingers across the keys. The combination was the date Debussy had composed it, 1890. The lock clicked. Open immediately. Inside was a treasure trove of evidence that would have made any prosecutor weep with joy. Margaret had been far more prepared for this battle than I'd ever imagined. There were printed emails between my parents and Michael dating back 3 years, discussions about how to handle Margaret's inevitable death and ensure the inheritance stayed within their control. There were transcripts of recorded phone conversations where they discussed having her declared mentally incompetent. Most damning of all, there were copies of documents showing they'd already attempted to file papers questioning her mental capacity 6 months before her death. One email from my mother to Michael was particularly revealing. "We need to be careful about Sarah. She was always Margaret's favorite, and the old woman might do something sentimental and stupid with the will. We should start documenting instances of her being irresponsible with money, build a case that she's not mature enough to handle a large inheritance." My father's response was equally chilling, "Already on it. I've been keeping records of her freelance income irregularities and her student loan defaults from 10 years ago. If Margaret leaves her anything significant, we can paint her as financially unstable and argue that the bequest should be redirected to more responsible family members." They'd been building a case against me for years, documenting every financial struggle I'd experienced, every career setback, every moment of vulnerability that could be weaponized against me in court. The student loan defaults they'd mentioned were from a period when I'd been hospitalized for 3 months after a car accident, unable to work and drowning in medical bills. Rather than offering help, they'd apparently been taking notes on my misfortune for future use. But perhaps the most devastating discovery was a series of recordings Margaret had made using a small digital device. Her voice, clear and sharp, captured conversation after conversation where my family discussed their plans for her estate. In one particularly damaging recording from just 2 months before her death, I could hear my mother's voice clearly. "We need to move fast on this. The doctors say she's got 6 months at most, and we can't let her have time to do anything crazy with the will." Michael's voice responded, "What about the competency hearing? Can we accelerate that?" My father's voice joined in, "Richard thinks we can get a temporary conservatorship if we can show she's making irrational decisions. The oil money makes this urgent. We're talking about generational wealth here, not just the ranch." "What about Sarah?" my mother asked. "She's been spending more time out here lately." "Sarah's not a threat," my father replied dismissively. "She's never shown any interest in business or money management. Even if Margaret tries to leave her something, we can easily demonstrate that she's not equipped to handle it." Listening to them discuss my future, my worth, my capabilities like I was a problem to be managed rather than a family member to be loved, I felt something fundamental shift inside me. This wasn't just about money or property or even Margaret's final wishes. This was about a lifetime of systematic devaluation, of being treated as less important, less capable, less deserving of consideration than my brother. I spent the rest of the afternoon in Margaret's basement, methodically documenting every piece of evidence she'd collected. There were financial records showing that my parents had been borrowing money against their expectation of inheriting the ranch, taking out loans and making investments based on wealth they assumed would be theirs. Michael had apparently quit his job 6 months earlier and was living off credit cards, confident that the inheritance would cover his debts and fund his early retirement. More disturbing were the medical records Margaret had somehow obtained, showing that my parents had been pressuring her doctors for information about her prognosis and mental state. They'd even attempted to have her declared incompetent while she was undergoing chemotherapy, arguing that the cancer treatments were affecting her judgment. Only her oncologist's firm refusal to support their claims had prevented them from succeeding. But Margaret's most impressive preparation was a detailed timeline she'd created, documenting every instance of manipulation, pressure, and attempted coercion she'd experienced from my parents over the past 5 years. She'd noted dates, times, witnesses, and outcomes with the precision of a forensic accountant. She'd even included photographs of damage to her property after particularly heated arguments with my father, showing overturned furniture and broken picture frames that told a story of intimidation and emotional abuse. As I read through her meticulous documentation, I began to understand that Margaret's decision to leave everything to me hadn't been sentimental or impulsive. It had been strategic, the culmination of years of watching her own son and daughter-in-law reveal their true characters. She'd seen their greed, their entitlement, their willingness to manipulate and deceive for personal gain. She'd also seen my genuine love for her, my respect for her values, and my complete lack of interest in her wealth during her lifetime. One note in particular brought tears to my eyes: "Sarah visits because she wants to spend time with me, not because she wants something from me. She helps with the garden, listens to my stories, plays piano with me for hours. She's the only one who remembers my birthday without being reminded, the only one who calls just to check if I'm okay. If I leave my legacy to her, it will be because she's the only one who truly understands what it means to preserve something valuable rather than simply consume it." By the time I finished reading through Margaret's evidence collection, the sun had set and the house had grown cold. I carefully returned everything to the metal box and secured it back in its hiding place, but not before making digital copies of the most important documents. I now had proof of conspiracy, attempted fraud, elder abuse, and conspiracy to commit perjury. I had evidence that my family had been systematically planning to steal Margaret's estate for years, and that they'd been prepared to destroy my reputation and financial future to achieve their goals. But I also understood that simply producing this evidence wouldn't be enough. My family had demonstrated a level of cunning and preparation that went far beyond what I'd initially assumed. They'd consulted lawyers, filed preliminary paperwork, and built a comprehensive case for their position. They'd even managed to convince some of Margaret's neighbors and friends that I'd been taking advantage of her in her final years, spreading rumors about my supposed financial desperation and inappropriate influence over her decisions. Walking back to my car in the darkness, I felt the weight of what lay ahead. This wasn't going to be a simple matter of producing the real will and watching my family slink away in shame. They'd invested too much time, money, and reputation in their version of events to simply admit defeat. They were going to fight me with everything they had, using every advantage their wealth and connections could provide. But as I drove back toward Austin, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: complete clarity about who I was and what I was fighting for. This wasn't about the money, though the financial security would certainly change my life. This wasn't about proving my family wrong, though their underestimation of me had been both painful and motivating. This was about honoring Margaret's faith in me, preserving her legacy, and finally standing up to people who'd spent my entire life trying to convince me I was worth less than I knew myself to be. The next morning, I called in sick to my freelance commitments and began making a different kind of preparation. I researched estate attorneys who specialized in complex inheritance disputes, focusing on lawyers who had experience dealing with family members attempting to manipulate or coerce elderly relatives. I needed someone who understood that this case involved more than just legal technicalities. It required a comprehensive understanding of family dynamics, financial manipulation, and psychological abuse. I also began my own surveillance operation. If my family was comfortable treating Margaret's property as their personal headquarters, I wanted to document their continued trespassing and unauthorized occupation. I purchased a small, discreet camera system and returned to the ranch that evening to install it in locations where it would capture anyone entering or leaving the property. What I discovered over the next week shocked me even more than what I'd found in Margaret's hidden evidence collection. My family wasn't just searching the house, they were actively stripping it of valuable items. I watched through the camera feeds as they loaded Margaret's antique furniture into trucks, removed her jewelry and silver, and even took her piano, the same instrument where she'd taught me to play Clair de Lune all those years ago. They were stealing from an estate they didn't legally control, selling off assets before the will had been properly probated, and destroying evidence of Margaret's true relationship with me. Every item they removed was something that connected me to her memory, something that represented our shared history and her love for me. But their most audacious move came on a Thursday afternoon when I watched through the cameras as Richard Walsh arrived at the ranch with a moving crew and what appeared to be an oil company representative. They were conducting surveys of the property, measuring distances, marking locations, and clearly preparing to begin drilling operations. They were so confident in their eventual control of the estate that they were already making deals with energy companies, probably signing contracts based on their assumed ownership of the mineral rights. That evening, I received a call from Michael that confirmed my worst suspicions. His voice was carefully casual, the tone he'd always used when he was trying to manipulate me into doing something I didn't want to do. "Hey, Sarah, how are you holding up? I know this whole thing with Margaret's estate has been tough on everyone." "I'm managing," I said carefully, not wanting to reveal anything about what I discovered. Good. Listen, I wanted to give you a heads up about something. We've been working with some developers who are interested in the ranch property. Nothing's final yet, but it looks like we might be able to get a really good price for the land." "Developers?" I asked, feigning ignorance. "Yeah, some energy company that wants to explore the mineral rights. Dad thinks we could get maybe 15 or 20 million for the whole package. Pretty amazing, right?" Margaret would have been thrilled to know the old place would finally be worth something significant. The casual lie was breathtaking. They were planning to sell Margaret's legacy for a fraction of its actual value, probably to a company that was working with Richard Walsh to structure a deal that would benefit him financially. They weren't just stealing my inheritance, they were preparing to squander it for their own immediate gratification. "That's interesting," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "What about the family's sentimental attachment to the place?" Michael laughed, a sound completely devoid of affection or respect. "Come on, Sarah, be realistic. None of us are ranchers. The property's just going to be a burden and an expense if we try to maintain it. Better to sell it now while the market's good and split the proceeds among people who can actually use the money productively." "Split the proceeds," I repeated. "What about the will?" "Well, obviously we're still working through the legal complexities of that situation," Michael said, his tone becoming more guarded. "But regardless of how the technicalities work out, we're all family. We'll make sure everyone gets their fair share." Their fair share. After watching them strip Margaret's house bare, after reading their plans to have me declared incompetent, after listening to them discuss my worthlessness for years, they were still pretending that their eventual theft would be an act of family generosity. "That's very thoughtful of you," I said, injecting just enough gratitude into my voice to maintain the illusion that I was still the compliant, defeated person they expected me to be. "Of course," Michael replied, his confidence returning. "We're family, right? We take care of each other." After hanging up, I sat in my apartment staring at the evidence I'd collected over the past week. Video footage of theft, audio recordings of conspiracy, financial documents showing fraud, medical records proving attempted elder abuse. I had enough material to not only win the inheritance dispute but to have my entire family charged with serious felonies. But I also understood that the moment I revealed what I knew, they would escalate their own efforts to destroy me. They would use every resource at their disposal to paint me as a vindictive, unstable person who was fabricating evidence and manipulating the legal system for personal gain. They would attack my character, my mental health, my financial history, and my relationship with Margaret. I needed to be prepared for total war, because that's exactly what this was going to become. The next morning, I began assembling my own team of professionals. Not just a lawyer, but a forensic accountant who could trace the stolen assets, a private investigator who could document my family's ongoing criminal activity, and a public relations consultant who could help me manage the inevitable media attention when this story eventually became public. Because I'd realized something important, this case wasn't just about my inheritance anymore. Margaret's evidence had revealed a pattern of elder abuse, financial manipulation, and systematic fraud that extended far beyond her individual situation. My family had been perfecting these techniques for years, probably using them on other elderly relatives and family friends who died without anyone to advocate for their interests. This was about justice, not just for Margaret and me, but for every elderly person who'd ever been manipulated or coerced by family members who saw their vulnerability as an opportunity for profit. As I prepared for the battle ahead, I felt Margaret's presence guiding me, her voice echoing in my memory, "Use it wisely." She hadn't just left me money and property, she'd left me the tools and evidence I needed to expose a system of abuse and ensure it could never happen again. My family thought they'd won by intimidating me into surrendering a fake check on Christmas morning. What they'd actually done was give me the perfect cover to prepare the most comprehensive legal counterattack they could possibly imagine. They had no idea what was coming for them. The law offices of Morrison, Chen and Associates occupied the entire 32nd floor of a downtown Austin high-rise, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a commanding view of the Texas state capitol. I'd chosen David Chen specifically because of his reputation for handling complex estate disputes involving family fraud, and because his firm had a track record of taking on wealthy, well-connected opponents and winning. As I sat in his conference room with my carefully organized evidence spread across the mahogany table, I felt like a general preparing for the most important battle of my life. David Chen was younger than I'd expected, maybe 45, with an intensity that reminded me of a chess master calculating moves several turns ahead. He'd spent the past 3 hours reviewing Margaret's hidden documentation, my surveillance footage, and the recordings she'd made of my family's conversations. His expression had grown progressively more serious as he absorbed the scope of what we were dealing with. "Sarah," he said finally, leaning back in his chair, "in 20 years of practicing estate law, I've never seen a case this comprehensively documented by the victim beforehand. Your grandmother essentially built our entire legal strategy for us before she died. Is it enough?" I asked, though I was already fairly confident of the answer. "It's more than enough to win the inheritance dispute," David replied. "But what you're describing goes far beyond a simple will contest. We're looking at elder abuse, conspiracy to commit fraud, theft of estate assets, attempted coercion of a vulnerable adult, and possibly RICO violations if we can prove this was part of a pattern of behavior targeting other elderly family members." I felt a chill at his words. "RICO violations?" "Racketeering charges," David explained. "If your family has been systematically targeting elderly relatives for financial exploitation, which these documents suggest they have, we could be looking at federal charges that carry sentences of 20 years or more." He gestured toward a particular set of documents that had caught his attention. "These bank records show suspicious financial activity involving 3 other deceased relatives over the past decade. Large transfers shortly before death, sudden changes in beneficiaries, contested wills that were settled quickly and quietly. Your grandmother documented pattern behavior that suggests your parents and brother have been perfecting these techniques for years." The realization hit me like a physical blow. Great-Aunt Dorothy, who died 5 years earlier and whose estate had been complicated according to my parents. Uncle James, who'd supposedly left everything to a charity none of us had ever heard of. Cousin Helen, whose will had been contested by distant relatives but settled out of court for reasons that were never fully explained to me. All of them elderly, all of them isolated from the broader family by my parents' careful management of information and relationships. "They've done this before," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Multiple times, from what I can see," David confirmed. "Your case isn't just about recovering your inheritance, Sarah. It's about exposing a criminal enterprise that's been operating within your family for years. The question is, how far are you prepared to take this?" I thought about Margaret's letter, about her trust in my judgment and her faith that I would use her legacy wisely. I thought about the elderly relatives who died without anyone to advocate for their interests, whose final wishes had been subverted by people who were supposed to love and protect them. I thought about my parents' casual cruelty on Christmas morning, their willingness to destroy my reputation and future for their own benefit. "All the way," I said firmly. "Whatever it takes to make sure they can never do this to anyone else." David nodded approvingly. "Then we're going to need a comprehensive strategy that addresses both the civil and criminal aspects of this case. I'm going to recommend that we coordinate with both the District Attorney's Office and the FBI's White-Collar Crime Division. This kind of systematic elder abuse falls under federal jurisdiction, especially given the interstate nature of some of these transactions." Over the next 4 hours, we developed a multi-phase legal strategy that was both elegant and devastating. Phase 1 would involve filing emergency motions to freeze all estate assets and prevent any further disposal of Margaret's property. We would also seek immediate injunctions against my family's ongoing trespassing and theft, using my surveillance footage as evidence of their continued criminal activity. Phase 2 would be the formal presentation of the authentic will, along with comprehensive evidence of my family's attempts to manipulate and defraud the estate. We would simultaneously file criminal complaints with local and federal authorities, providing them with Margaret's evidence of the broader pattern of elder abuse. Phase 3 would be the counteroffensive, where we would pursue civil suits for emotional distress, defamation, and conspiracy, while cooperating with federal prosecutors to build criminal cases that could result in significant prison sentences. But David's most brilliant insight was about timing and leverage. Your family believes they've neutralized you, he observed. They think you're defeated and compliant, which means they're going to continue their illegal activities without taking precautions. We want to encourage that overconfidence, let them dig themselves deeper into criminal liability before we spring. The trap. What do you mean? I asked. I mean we're going to let them think they're winning for a few more weeks while we finalize our preparations. Every day they continue occupying that ranch illegally, every asset they steal, every lie they tell to potential buyers strengthens our case. They're creating new evidence of their criminal intent with every action they take. The strategy required tremendous self-control on my part. While my family continued to dismantle Margaret's legacy piece by piece, I had to maintain the pretense of being the defeated, compliant person they expected me to be. I continued working my freelance design projects, paying my modest bills, living in my small apartment like someone who'd permanently given up on any dreams of financial security. But behind the scenes, I was methodically building the most comprehensive legal case my family could possibly imagine. David introduced me to Dr. Patricia Williams, a forensic psychiatrist who specialized in evaluating the mental capacity of elderly individuals who'd been subjected to coercion and manipulation. After reviewing Margaret's medical records and the audio recordings she'd made, Dr. Williams was prepared to testify that Margaret had been completely competent when she made her will, and that my family's attempts to have her declared incompetent were themselves evidence of psychological abuse. We also brought in Marcus Rodriguez, a forensic accountant who began tracing the financial trail of my family's activities. What he discovered was even more extensive than what Margaret had documented. Over the past 15 years, my parents and Michael had been involved in suspicious financial transactions surrounding the deaths of 7 elderly relatives, collecting nearly $12 million in inheritances, insurance payouts, and property sales that should have been distributed more broadly among surviving family members. They've been running a sophisticated operation, Marcus explained during one of our strategy sessions. They identify elderly relatives who've accumulated significant assets, then systematically isolate them from other family members while building relationships based on appearing helpful and supportive. Once they've gained the person's trust, they pressure them to change wills, transfer assets, or make them beneficiaries of insurance policies. How have they gotten away with it for so long? I asked. Because they're smart about it, Marcus replied. They never take everything, just the majority. They leave enough for other relatives to prevent them from feeling completely cheated, and they're careful to target people who don't have strong advocates or close family ties. Most importantly, they've been reinvesting the money in legitimate businesses and properties, so they can claim their wealth comes from successful investments rather than inheritance fraud. The scope of their criminal enterprise was staggering. They'd turned elder abuse into a business model, systematically targeting vulnerable family members for financial exploitation while maintaining a facade of respectability and success. My father's consulting business, my mother's boutique, Michael's early retirement, the expensive cars and lavish vacations I'd always assumed were the result of smart financial planning were actually funded by what amounted to an inheritance theft ring. But perhaps the most infuriating discovery was how they'd manipulated my own relationship with the extended family. For years, they'd been telling relatives that I was unstable, financially irresponsible, and estranged from the family by choice. They'd systematically poisoned my relationships with aunts, uncles, and cousins to ensure that I would never be seen as a credible advocate for elderly relatives who were being targeted. They've been preparing to discredit you for years, David observed. Every family gathering where they made jokes about your financial struggles, every conversation where they portrayed you as the irresponsible artistic type who couldn't handle real-world responsibilities, was actually a calculated effort to undermine your credibility in case you ever tried to challenge their activities. The personal betrayal was devastating, but it also strengthened my resolve. This wasn't just about recovering Margaret's inheritance anymore, it was about exposing a systematic campaign of abuse and manipulation that had affected dozens of people over more than a decade. As we prepared our legal offensive, I continued my surveillance of the ranch property. What I observed over the following weeks provided crucial evidence of my family's ongoing criminal activity. They'd moved beyond simply searching the house and stealing valuables. They were now conducting business meetings on the property, showing it to potential buyers, and even beginning preliminary work to prepare drilling sites for oil extraction. Most damaging of all was a conversation I captured between my father and Richard Walsh, their attorney, where they discussed the need to accelerate the timeline because they were concerned about potential complications with my apparent compliance. They knew I'd given up too easily, and they were worried about what I might be planning. "We need to get the property sold and the assets liquidated before Sarah figures out what happened," my father's voice came through clearly on the recording. "Once the oil rights are transferred and the cash is distributed, it won't matter if she tries to challenge anything later." Richard Walsh's response was equally incriminating. "I can have the sale documents ready by next week. The energy company is willing to pay $30 million for immediate mineral rights transfer, which gives us plenty of liquidity to handle any legal challenges. Even if Sarah produces some kind of alternative documentation, it'll be too late to recover assets that have already been sold to third parties." They were planning to complete the theft within days, selling Margaret's property for a fraction of its value to create facts on the ground that would be difficult to reverse even if I somehow proved my legal rights to the estate. The urgency in their voices told me that my window for action was closing rapidly. That evening, I called David with the latest recordings. "They're moving faster than we expected," I told him. "We need to act now or risk losing everything to a fraudulent sale." "I agree," David replied immediately. "I've been preparing the emergency motions for exactly this scenario. We can file first thing tomorrow morning and have injunctions in place by the afternoon. Are you ready for this to become public?" I thought about the comfortable fiction I'd been living for the past month, pretending to be defeated while secretly building the case that would destroy my family's criminal enterprise. I thought about Margaret's trust in me, about the other elderly relatives who died without anyone to fight for their interests, about the need to ensure this pattern of abuse could never continue. "I'm ready," I said. The next morning, David and I walked into the Travis County Courthouse carrying boxes of evidence that represented the most comprehensive elder abuse case the court had ever seen. We filed simultaneous motions for emergency injunctions, contested will proceedings, and criminal complaints that would trigger investigations by both local and federal authorities. Within hours, my family's world began to collapse around them. Court officers served them with cease and desist orders that immediately froze all estate assets and prohibited any further activity on Margaret's property. Federal agents executed search warrants on their homes and businesses, seizing computers, financial records, and documents related to their various inheritance schemes. But the most satisfying moment came when I received a phone call from Michael, his voice shaking with panic and rage. "Sarah, what the hell have you done? There are federal agents at my house. They're seizing everything. They're talking about RICO charges and 20-year sentences." "I'm not sure what you mean," I replied calmly, maintaining the innocent tone I'd perfected over the past month. "Don't play dumb with me," Michael snapped. "They have recordings, surveillance footage, financial documents going back 15 years. They know about Dorothy and James and Helen and all the others. How could you do this to your own family?" "How could I do this?" I repeated, allowing some steel to enter my voice for the first time. "Michael, you and our parents have been running a criminal enterprise targeting elderly relatives for over a decade. You stole millions of dollars from people who trusted you, you psychologically abused vulnerable adults, and you tried to steal my inheritance by destroying Margaret's final wishes. The question isn't how I could expose you, the question is how you could have done these things in the first place." The silence that followed lasted nearly a minute. When Michael finally spoke again, his voice had changed completely, becoming the wheedling, manipulative tone he'd used to get his way since childhood. "Sarah, please, we can work this out. It doesn't have to go this far. We're family, we should handle this privately. Think about what this will do to Mom and Dad, think about the scandal, the publicity. Is that really what you want?" "What I want," I said quietly, "is for Margaret's final wishes to be honored, for the money you've stolen from elderly relatives to be recovered and returned to their rightful heirs, and for you to face the consequences of 15 years of systematic elder abuse. What I want is justice, Michael, something you've clearly forgotten the meaning of. You're making a huge mistake," Michael said, his voice hardening again. "We have resources, connections, the best lawyers money can buy. You think some small-time Austin attorney can go up against the kind of legal team we can assemble? You're going to lose everything, and you're going to look like a vindictive, mentally unstable person who destroyed her own family over money." "We'll see," I replied, and hung up. Within hours, the story had leaked to local media outlets. "Prominent Austin family charged in multi-million-dollar elder abuse scheme," read the headline in the Austin American-Statesman. The article detailed the federal charges, the seized assets, and the scope of the investigation into what prosecutors were calling one of the most sophisticated inheritance fraud operations they'd ever encountered. My phone rang constantly throughout the day with calls from reporters, distant relatives, and people who claimed to have information about other potential victims of my family's schemes. David's office was coordinating with a task force that now included the FBI, the IRS, and the Texas Attorney General's office, all working together to unravel the full extent of the criminal enterprise. But the most important call came from Patricia Chen, an investigative journalist with the Houston Chronicle who'd been researching patterns of elder abuse in wealthy Texas families. Ms. Thompson, she said, I've been following your case since the charges were filed this morning. I believe your family's activities are part of a much larger pattern of inheritance fraud that's been operating across Texas for years. Would you be willing to speak with me about what you've discovered? As I considered her request, I realized that Margaret's legacy was already expanding beyond what either of us could have imagined. The evidence she'd collected and the case we'd built wasn't just going to recover my inheritance and punish my family's crimes. It was going to expose a systematic problem that affected elderly people across the state and potentially the country. Yes, I told Patricia Chen. I think it's time for this story to be told completely. The next morning, I woke up to find my story on the front page of newspapers across Texas. Margaret's careful documentation and my methodical legal strategy had not only secured my inheritance but had also triggered what prosecutors were calling the largest elder abuse investigation in state history. My family had spent decades perfecting techniques for exploiting vulnerable elderly relatives, convinced that their wealth and social status would protect them from consequences. They'd never imagined that the quiet, artistic granddaughter they'd always dismissed would have the intelligence, determination, and resources to build a case that would destroy everything they'd worked to create. But more importantly, they'd never understood that Margaret's real gift to me wasn't the money or the property, it was the knowledge that I was worthy of love, respect, and justice, and that I had the strength to fight for all three when they were threatened. As I prepared to walk into the courthouse for the formal reading of Margaret's authentic will, I carried with me not just legal documents but the weight of responsibility for ensuring that her legacy would protect other elderly people from the kind of abuse she'd experienced and documented. My family's criminal enterprise was finished, but the work of seeking justice for all their victims was just beginning. The Travis County Courthouse had never seen anything quite like the media circus that surrounded the formal probate hearing for Margaret Thompson's estate. News vans lined the street, reporters jostled for position on the courthouse steps, and camera crews captured every person entering the building. What had started as a family inheritance dispute had exploded into a federal investigation that was making headlines across the country. I walked through the chaos with David Chen at my side, carrying the original will and the metal box containing Margaret's evidence in a leather briefcase that had belonged to my grandmother. Despite the crowds and cameras, I felt strangely calm. After weeks of preparation and strategic planning, the moment of truth had finally arrived. Today, my family would learn that their carefully orchestrated theft had been anticipated, documented, and thoroughly prepared for by the woman they'd tried to manipulate. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was electric with tension. My parents sat with Michael and Richard Walsh at one table, surrounded by a team of expensive attorneys they'd hastily assembled once the federal charges were filed. They looked haggard and desperate, like people who'd watched their entire world crumble overnight. My mother kept glancing toward the door as if expecting someone to come rescue them from this nightmare. My father sat rigidly upright, his jaw clenched with the kind of barely controlled fury I remembered from childhood when things didn't go according to his plans. Michael looked the worst of all. The confident, successful lawyer who'd always been. The family's golden child now appeared hollow and defeated. Federal agents had raided his apartment and office, seizing computers, financial records, and evidence of his participation in the inheritance fraud scheme. His legal career was over. His reputation destroyed, and he was facing the possibility of decades in federal prison. Judge Eleanor Martinez entered the courtroom with the bearing of someone who'd seen everything in her 30 years on the bench but was still occasionally surprised by the depths of human greed and betrayal. She'd reviewed all the evidence in advance, and her expression suggested that she was not impressed with what my family had attempted to accomplish. This court is convened to address the matter of the estate of Margaret Louise Thompson, deceased, Judge Martinez announced. I understand there are competing claims regarding the validity of Mrs. Thompson's final will and testament. Richard Walsh stood immediately, his voice confident despite the circumstances his clients found themselves in. Your Honor, we maintain that the will purporting to leave Mrs. Thompson's entire estate to her granddaughter Sarah Thompson is invalid due to the deceased's compromised mental state at the time of execution. We have medical evidence suggesting that Mrs. Thompson was suffering from early-stage dementia and was therefore not competent to make such significant decisions. David Chen rose to respond, and I could see the controlled anger in his posture. Your Honor, we categorically dispute any claim that Margaret Thompson was mentally incompetent. In fact, we have extensive evidence that Mrs. Thompson was not only fully competent but was actively documenting attempts by family members to manipulate and coerce her into changing her estate planning to benefit them financially. Judge Martinez nodded toward David. Mr. Chen, please present your evidence regarding the validity of the will in question. What followed was the most satisfying hour of my life. David methodically presented Margaret's authentic will, signed and witnessed with all proper legal formalities. He then introduced the recordings Margaret had made of my family's conversations, playing audio that captured them discussing their plans to have her declared incompetent and to contest any will that didn't favor them. The courtroom fell completely silent as my father's voice filled the space. We need to move fast on this. The doctors say she's got 6 months at most, and we can't let her have time to do anything crazy with the will. My mother's response followed. What about the competency hearing? Can we accelerate that? Michael's voice was clear and damning. Richard thinks we can get a temporary conservatorship if we can show she's making irrational decisions. The oil money makes this urgent. The expressions on my family's faces as they heard their own voices exposing their conspiracy were priceless. My mother actually gasped audibly, covering her mouth with her hand as if she could somehow take back words that had been spoken months earlier. My father's face turned purple with rage and embarrassment, while Michael slumped in his chair like a deflated balloon. But David wasn't finished. He presented the medical evaluations from Dr. Patricia Williams, demonstrating conclusively that Margaret had been mentally sharp until the day she died. He showed the surveillance footage of my family systematically looting Margaret's house, stealing her belongings while claiming to be searching for important documents. He introduced the forensic accounting evidence showing their pattern of inheritance fraud targeting multiple elderly relatives over 15 years. Perhaps most devastating of all was the presentation of Margaret's detailed timeline documenting every instance of pressure, manipulation, and attempted coercion she'd experienced. Her meticulous notes painted a picture of systematic psychological abuse designed to isolate her from other family members and make her dependent on my parents and Michael for financial and emotional support. When David finished his presentation, the courtroom was so quiet you could hear the air conditioning humming. Judge Martinez took several minutes to review her notes before addressing the parties. This court finds the evidence of Margaret Thompson's mental competency at the time of will execution to be overwhelming and conclusive, she announced. Furthermore, this court is deeply disturbed by the evidence of systematic attempts to manipulate and coerce the deceased, as well as the subsequent criminal activity involving theft of estate assets and conspiracy to defraud. She turned toward Richard Walsh and my family's legal team. The will presented by the contestants, which purportedly left the estate to Robert and Linda Thompson, is hereby declared invalid as it was clearly executed under duress and through fraudulent misrepresentation of the deceased's mental state. My heart was pounding as Judge Martinez continued. The will presented by Sarah Thompson is hereby declared valid and authentic. Sarah Thompson is the sole beneficiary of Margaret Thompson's estate, including all real property, mineral rights, financial assets, and personal belongings. The courtroom erupted in murmurs and whispers, but Judge Martinez wasn't finished. Her voice took on a tone of barely controlled anger as she addressed my family directly. This court has rarely seen such a clear case of elder abuse, financial exploitation, and attempted theft of estate assets. The evidence presented today demonstrates a calculated campaign to manipulate a vulnerable elderly woman for financial gain, followed by systematic theft of her property after her death. She looked directly at my parents and Michael. Your behavior has been not only legally reprehensible but morally unconscionable. You have betrayed every principle of family loyalty and filial responsibility in pursuit of financial gain that was never rightfully yours. Richard Walsh made a desperate attempt to salvage something from the disaster. Your Honor, my clients request time to appeal this decision and to present additional evidence regarding Judge Martinez cut him off with a wave of her hand. Mr. Walsh, given that your clients are currently under federal investigation for multiple felonies related to this case and others, I would suggest they focus their attention on criminal defense rather than futile civil appeals. This court's decision is final. As the hearing concluded and people began filing out of the courtroom, I remained seated for a moment, absorbing the magnitude of what had just happened. Margaret's estate was officially mine, her final wishes had been honored, and the systematic abuse she'd endured had been exposed and condemned by the highest legal authority in the county. But my personal vindication was only part of the victory. Over the past week, Margaret's evidence had triggered investigations into my family's treatment of 7 other elderly relatives, leading to the recovery of nearly $8 million in stolen assets that would be returned to legitimate heirs. Federal prosecutors were preparing charges that could result in sentences of 20 to 30 years for my parents and Michael. As I stood to leave, my mother approached me with tears streaming down her face. For a moment, I thought she might apologize, might acknowledge the terrible things they'd done and express genuine remorse for their actions. Instead, she grabbed my arm and hissed, "How could you do this to us? We're your family. We raised you. We fed you, we put a roof over your head, and this is how you repay us?" The audacity of her words, the complete lack of self-awareness or accountability, confirmed everything I'd come to understand about my family's fundamental character. Even now, facing federal charges and public humiliation, she saw herself as the victim and me as the ungrateful daughter who'd destroyed her life. I gently removed her hand from my arm and looked into her eyes. "Mom, you spent 15 years systematically abusing elderly relatives for money. You stole from people who trusted you, you manipulated vulnerable adults, and you tried to destroy Margaret's final wishes because they didn't benefit you financially. You didn't raise me to be the kind of person who would ignore that kind of behavior, and I won't start now." My father stepped forward, his face contorted with rage. "You self-righteous little brat," he snarled. "You think you're so much better than us, but you're just greedy like everyone else. This whole thing is about you wanting the money for yourself." "No, Dad," I replied calmly. "This is about honoring the wishes of a woman who loved me enough to document your abuse and give me the tools to stop it. This is about making sure that no other elderly person has to endure what Margaret went through. And yes, this is about me finally standing up to people who spent my entire life trying to convince me I was worth less than I knew myself to be." Michael joined them, his lawyer persona completely abandoned in favor of raw desperation. "Sarah, please, think about what you're doing. We can still work this out privately. You could have the inheritance, we could disappear, everyone could move on with their lives. You don't have to destroy us completely." I looked at my brother, this person who'd been held up as the family's success story while I was dismissed as the irresponsible artistic type. "Michael, you've been stealing from elderly relatives for 15 years. You participated in psychologically abusing Margaret while she was dying of cancer. You helped our parents convince her doctors to question her mental capacity so you could control her medical and financial decisions. You personally stole antiques, jewelry, and furniture from her house after she died." I paused, letting the weight of his crimes sink in. "You didn't make a mistake, you didn't have a moment of poor judgment, you built a criminal enterprise. The only reason I'm not trying to destroy you is because you've already destroyed yourselves." As my family walked away, probably heading to meet with their criminal defense attorneys, I felt a profound sense of completion. The quiet, overlooked granddaughter they'd always underestimated had methodically dismantled their criminal operation using the very qualities they'd mocked: attention to detail, strategic thinking, and unwavering determination. Outside the courthouse, reporters surrounded me with questions about the case, the federal investigation, and my plans for the inheritance. David had prepared me for this moment, coaching me on how to balance transparency with legal caution. "This case was never about money," I told them. "It was about honoring my grandmother's final wishes and exposing a pattern of elder abuse that had been ongoing for years. Margaret Thompson trusted me to use her legacy wisely, and that includes ensuring that other elderly people don't experience the manipulation and exploitation she documented." Patricia Chen from the Houston Chronicle asked the question I'd been expecting: "What do you plan to do with the $45 million inheritance?" I thought about Margaret's letter, about her hope that I would use the money not just to secure my future but to build something meaningful. I thought about the dozens of elderly people who'd been victimized by inheritance fraud schemes similar to what my family had perpetrated. "I'm establishing the Margaret Thompson Foundation for Elder Protection," I announced. "It will provide legal assistance to elderly people facing financial manipulation, fund research into inheritance fraud prevention, and support prosecution of those who exploit vulnerable adults. My family turned elder abuse into a business model. I'm going to turn stopping elder abuse into my life's mission." The next morning, I woke up in a luxury hotel suite that David had insisted I use for security reasons while the media attention remained intense. Federal marshals were providing protection after we'd received several threatening messages from people who claimed to be acting on my family's behalf. But despite the chaos and security concerns, I felt a peace I'd never experienced before. Margaret's ranch was officially mine, along with the mineral rights that would provide ongoing income for generations. The oil royalties alone would generate several $1 million annually, giving me the financial freedom to pursue any dream or goal I could imagine. More importantly, I'd proven something to myself that I'd never been completely sure of before. I was strong enough to stand up to people who tried to diminish or control me, smart enough to outmaneuver those who underestimated me, and worthy of the love and respect that Margaret had always shown me. Over the next few weeks, as federal prosecutors built their cases against my family and I began establishing the foundation that would become Margaret's lasting legacy, I received hundreds of letters from people who'd read about the case in the media. Many were from elderly individuals who'd experienced similar manipulation from family members but had never found the courage or resources to fight back. Others were from adult children who discovered suspicious circumstances surrounding their parents' deaths and wanted advice on how to investigate potential fraud. The scope of the problem was staggering. Elder abuse was a largely hidden epidemic, affecting millions of vulnerable adults who were being systematically exploited by people they trusted. Margaret's meticulous documentation and my legal victory had opened a door that would allow countless other victims to seek justice and protection. 6 months later, my parents and Michael were sentenced to federal prison terms ranging from 15 to 25 years. Richard Walsh lost his law license and received a 10-year sentence for his role in facilitating the fraud schemes. The stolen assets were recovered and returned to legitimate heirs, while the Margaret Thompson Foundation began providing legal assistance to elder abuse victims across Texas and beyond. But perhaps the most satisfying moment came when I received a letter from Dorothy Henderson, the daughter of my great-aunt Dorothy who died 5 years earlier. She'd read about the case and recognized the pattern of behavior that had surrounded her mother's death. "Because of your courage in exposing what your family did," she wrote, "we were able to reopen the investigation into my mother's estate and recover over $2 million that had been stolen through fraudulent transfers. More importantly, we now understand that my mother wasn't losing her mental faculties in her final years, she was being systematically manipulated and gaslit by people she trusted. Thank you for giving us the truth about what really happened." To her. Standing in Margaret's garden on the first anniversary of her death, surrounded by the roses she'd tended for decades, I finally understood the full meaning of her final gift to me. The money and property were wonderful, but they weren't the real inheritance. What she'd given me was the knowledge that I was worthy of love, the tools to fight for justice, and the responsibility to protect others who couldn't protect themselves. My family had tried to steal Margaret's legacy, but what they'd actually done was ensure that her impact would extend far beyond what any of us could have imagined. The foundation bearing her name would protect elderly people for generations to come, funded by the very wealth they'd tried to steal and empowered by the evidence of abuse they'd been too arrogant to hide effectively. Margaret's final wishes hadn't just been honored, they'd been transformed into a movement that would change how society addresses elder abuse and inheritance fraud. My quiet, methodical grandmother had orchestrated not just my personal vindication, but a systematic revolution in elder protection that would benefit countless people she'd never meet. Standing there among her roses, I could almost hear her voice whispering on the wind, "Use it wisely, my dear. Use it wisely." 5 years after that Christmas morning when my parents burned what they thought was a $45 million check, I stood at the podium of the National Conference on Elder Protection, addressing an audience of prosecutors, social workers, and advocates from across the country. The woman speaking now bore little resemblance to the struggling freelance designer who had once allowed her family to intimidate her into silence. The inheritance had changed my financial circumstances, but the fight for justice had transformed my entire identity. The Margaret Thompson Foundation had grown beyond anything I could have imagined when I first announced its creation on the courthouse steps. What began as a personal mission to honor my grandmother's memory had evolved into a national organization with offices in 12 states, a legal team of 47 attorneys, and a track record of recovering over $200 million in stolen assets for elder abuse victims. We'd helped prosecute more than 300 cases of inheritance fraud, assisted in the passage of stronger elder protection laws in 38 states, and provided support services to thousands of families dealing with financial exploitation. The transformation hadn't been easy or immediate. Those first months after the trial were a whirlwind of media attention, legal complications, and the overwhelming responsibility of managing wealth I'd never expected to possess. The oil royalties from Margaret's ranch generated approximately $4 million annually, creating a steady income stream that allowed me to fund the foundation's operations while maintaining my personal financial security. But money alone couldn't have created the impact we'd achieved. What made the foundation successful was something far more valuable: the credibility that came from having lived through the experience myself, combined with Margaret's meticulous documentation of how sophisticated inheritance fraud operations actually worked. We understood the psychology of manipulation, the legal vulnerabilities that predators exploited, and the emotional devastation that victims experienced when their own families betrayed them. The conference audience listened intently as I shared statistics that still shocked me, even after years of working in this field. Elder financial abuse affected 1 in 9 seniors annually, resulting in losses of over $36 billion each year. Family members were responsible for approximately 60% of these crimes, using their intimate knowledge of victims' fears, hopes, and weaknesses to manipulate them into transferring assets or changing estate plans. The case that brought many of you here today wasn't unique because of its scope or sophistication, I explained to the assembled professionals. It was unique because the victim had the foresight to document what was happening to her and the courage to trust someone else to seek justice on her behalf. Most elderly people facing financial exploitation don't have those advantages. What Margaret had given me wasn't just evidence of my family's crimes, she'd provided a blueprint for how to recognize, document, and prosecute elder abuse cases that could be replicated across the country. The Foundation's legal protocols, investigation techniques, and victim support services were all based on lessons learned from her careful preparation and my family's systematic criminal behavior. In the audience, I spotted several familiar faces. Prosecutors who'd worked on copycat cases inspired by my family's methods, attorneys who'd attended our training seminars, and advocates who'd used our resources to help their own clients. Among them was Detective Maria Santos from the Houston Police Department, who'd led the investigation into a multi-generational inheritance fraud ring that had stolen over $15 million from elderly victims using techniques nearly identical to what my parents and Michael had perfected. The Thompson case showed us that these crimes aren't isolated incidents committed by desperate individuals, Detective Santos had told me during our collaboration on her investigation. They're sophisticated operations run by people who've turned elder abuse into a professional enterprise. Understanding that changed everything about how we approach these cases. The ripple effects of Margaret's evidence and my decision to pursue comprehensive justice had extended far beyond our original case. Federal prosecutors had used the patterns we'd identified to develop new investigative techniques for detecting inheritance fraud. The IRS had created specialized units focused on tracking suspicious wealth transfers involving elderly individuals. State legislatures had passed laws requiring enhanced oversight of estate planning activities and stronger penalties for financial exploitation of vulnerable adults. But the most meaningful impact had been on individual families who'd found the courage to challenge suspicious circumstances surrounding their elderly relatives' final years. The Foundation's hotline received dozens of calls each week from people who'd recognized familiar patterns in our public education materials: sudden isolation of elderly relatives from other family members, unexplained changes in estate planning documents, mysterious transfers of assets to caregivers or family members, and attempts to have competent adults declared mentally incapable of managing their affairs. Each successful case brought its own satisfaction, but none more so than the letter I'd received just that morning from James McCarthy, whose 92-year-old father had been rescued from a scheme remarkably similar to what my family had attempted with Margaret. Because of the resources your foundation provided, we were able to expose what my stepmother was doing to my father before she succeeded in stealing his entire estate, James had written. The patterns you documented in your grandmother's case were exactly what we observed: isolation, manipulation, pressure to change his will, and attempts to have him declared incompetent when he resisted. Your legal team helped us build a case that not only protected my father but resulted in criminal charges against everyone involved in the scheme. Standing at the podium, I reflected on how different my life might have been if I'd simply accepted my family's version of events on that Christmas morning. If I'd believed their claims that Margaret was mentally incompetent, that I was too irresponsible to handle a large inheritance, that challenging their authority would destroy the family and accomplish nothing positive. The quiet, compliant person they'd expected me to remain would never have discovered the scope of their criminal activities or found the strength to expose them. The transformation hadn't been limited to my professional life. The confidence that came from successfully challenging people who'd underestimated me had affected every aspect of how I moved through the world. I'd learned to trust my own judgment, to recognize manipulation when I encountered it, and to stand firm in defending my values even when doing so was difficult or unpopular. My personal relationships had evolved as well. The isolation I'd experienced from extended family members who'd believed my parents' characterizations of me as unstable and irresponsible had largely been reversed as the truth about their criminal activities became public. Cousins, aunts, and uncles who'd kept their distance for years reached out to apologize for their misplaced loyalty and to express their admiration for my courage in exposing the abuse. Some relationships couldn't be salvaged. A few family members remained convinced that I'd overreacted to what they saw as normal family financial disagreements, refusing to acknowledge the systematic nature of my parents' and Michael's crimes. But I'd learned to accept that not everyone would understand or support my choices, and that seeking universal approval was less important than acting according to my own moral compass. The romantic relationship that had developed with David Chen over the past 3 years had been built on a foundation of mutual respect and shared commitment to justice that felt entirely different from anything I'd experienced before. He'd seen me at my most vulnerable and most determined, understood the complexity of my motivations, and supported my decision to dedicate significant portions of my inheritance to helping others rather than simply enjoying personal luxury. "You could have taken the money and disappeared," David had observed during one of our early conversations about the Foundation's mission. "You could have bought a mansion, traveled the world, lived a life of complete financial freedom without any obligations to anyone else. Instead, you've chosen to take on the responsibility of fighting a battle that will never truly end." He was right about the scope of the challenge. Elder abuse was a persistent problem that required sustained attention and resources to address effectively. Criminal prosecution could punish individual perpetrators, but prevention required changing cultural attitudes about aging, family relationships, and financial vulnerability. It required educating potential victims about warning signs, training professionals to recognize suspicious patterns, and creating support systems that could intervene before irreversible harm occurred. The Foundation's educational programs now reached millions of people annually through workshops, online resources, and media campaigns designed to raise awareness about inheritance fraud and financial exploitation. We developed training curricula for bank employees, medical professionals, and legal practitioners who were often the first to observe signs that elderly clients were being manipulated or coerced. Perhaps most importantly, we'd created a network of peer support groups where elderly individuals could share their experiences and learn from others who'd faced similar challenges. Many of our most effective advocates were people who'd survived attempted exploitation themselves and wanted to help others avoid or escape similar situations. The work had attracted attention from researchers studying the psychology of family dynamics and financial crime. Dr. Rebecca Martinez from the University of Texas had spent 2 years analyzing the evidence from my family's case to understand how seemingly respectable people could rationalize systematic abuse of vulnerable relatives. What's particularly striking about the Thompson case, Dr. Martinez had explained in her recently published study, is how the perpetrators developed increasingly sophisticated justifications for their behavior over time. They convinced themselves that they were protecting the family's financial interests, that their elderly relatives weren't capable of making responsible decisions, and that they deserved compensation for the burden of providing care and support. Her research had revealed that inheritance fraud often began with small boundary violations that were gradually escalated as perpetrators became more confident in their ability to manipulate victims and avoid detection. My parents and Michael had started with minor financial assistance that they failed to repay, progressed to unauthorized access to bank accounts and credit cards, and eventually developed the systematic approach to estate manipulation that had victimized multiple relatives over 15 years. Understanding this progression had helped the Foundation develop early intervention strategies that could identify and address problematic behavior before it escalated to criminal levels. We'd created resources for families dealing with boundary violations, financial disagreements, and caregiver conflicts that might otherwise develop into exploitation situations. The personal cost of this work had been significant at times. Testifying in criminal trials, reliving the details of Margaret's abuse, and confronting the ongoing reality of what my family had done required emotional resilience that I'd had to develop over time. Therapy had been essential, helping me process not just the betrayal and grief I'd experienced but also the responsibility that came with having resources and influence to help others. There were moments when the weight of expectations felt overwhelming. Victims and their families looked to me as someone who'd successfully challenged a powerful system and won comprehensive justice. Media outlets wanted me to comment on every high-profile elder abuse case. Politicians sought my endorsement for legislation they were proposing. Everyone seemed to expect that my experience had given me wisdom and insight that could solve problems I was still learning to understand myself. But Margaret's presence continued to guide me through these challenges. I'd kept her letter in my desk drawer, reading it whenever I felt uncertain about decisions or directions. Her words about using the inheritance wisely and building something meaningful had become the Foundation's unofficial mission statement, reminding me that the money was a tool for creating positive change rather than an end in itself. The ranch remained my primary residence, though I'd modernized and expanded it to accommodate the Foundation's growing operations. Margaret's garden had been preserved exactly as she'd maintained it, while new construction housed offices, conference facilities, and guest accommodations for visiting researchers and advocates. The oil wells continued to generate revenue that funded our work, creating a sustainable income stream that would support elder protection efforts for decades to come. Walking through the property each morning, I often paused at the small memorial garden I'd created in Margaret's honor. Her grave was marked with a simple granite stone engraved with her favorite quote from Maya Angelou: "A woman's heart should be so hidden in God that a man has to seek him just to find her." Below that, I'd added my own tribute: she sought justice and found it in the courage she gave to others. The irony wasn't lost on me that my family's attempts to steal Margaret's legacy had ultimately ensured its amplification far beyond what any of us could have imagined. Their greed and manipulation had provided the evidence needed to expose systematic problems affecting thousands of elderly people. Their criminality had funded the resources necessary to fight similar crimes on a national scale. Their betrayal had forged the determination and credibility that made meaningful change possible. During the conference's final session, a young prosecutor from Oregon approached me with a case file that looked remarkably familiar. "Ms. Thompson, I'm hoping you might review this situation and provide some guidance. We have a family that appears to be using techniques very similar to what your relatives employed, but we're struggling to prove the systematic nature of their activities." As I reviewed the documents she'd provided, I saw the same patterns Margaret had identified and documented years earlier: gradual isolation of elderly relatives, pressure to change estate planning documents, attempts to question mental capacity when manipulation failed, and systematic removal of assets before death could trigger probate proceedings. The techniques had been refined slightly, but the underlying approach remained unchanged. "This is exactly why the foundation exists," I told her. "We have protocols for investigating these cases, resources for supporting victims, and legal strategies that have proven effective in similar situations. More importantly, we have a network of professionals who understand how these schemes operate and can help you build a comprehensive case." That evening, as I prepared to return to Texas, I reflected on how completely my life had changed since that Christmas morning when I'd sat in my parents' living room listening to them threaten to destroy me if I didn't surrender Margaret's inheritance. The scared, financially struggling artist who'd torn up a fake check to avoid confrontation had evolved into someone capable of challenging powerful interests and winning systemic reforms. The money had certainly made a difference, providing the security and resources necessary to take risks and pursue justice without worrying about personal survival. But the real transformation had come from discovering that I was worthy of Margaret's faith, capable of strategic thinking under pressure, and strong enough to stand up to people who'd spent my entire life trying to convince me I was weak. The foundation's impact would continue growing long after I was gone, funded by oil royalties that would generate income for generations and guided by principles that Margaret had instilled through her example of patient, careful resistance to manipulation and abuse. What had begun as one woman's documentation of her family's criminal behavior had become a permanent institution dedicated to protecting vulnerable elderly people from similar exploitation. Flying home over the Texas landscape that Margaret had loved, I thought about the conversation we might have had if she'd lived to see what her evidence and trust had accomplished. I imagined her satisfaction at learning that her meticulous preparation had not only secured justice in our case but had provided tools for helping countless other families facing similar challenges. But most of all, I thought she'd be proud that I'd learned to see myself as she'd always seen me, not as the overlooked, undervalued granddaughter my parents had trained me to believe I was, but as someone with unique strengths, clear moral vision, and the courage to fight for what was right regardless of the personal cost. The inheritance she'd left me wasn't measured in dollars or acres or mineral rights. It was the knowledge that love and justice were worth fighting for, that systematic wrongs could be exposed and corrected by people willing to do the patient, careful work of building comprehensive cases and seeking lasting solutions. As the plane touched down in Austin, I smiled thinking about the calls I'd need to return, the cases waiting for review, and the ongoing work of building the legacy Margaret had entrusted to me. My family had thought they could steal her final wishes and crush my dreams of independence and recognition. Instead, they'd handed me the tools to build something far more valuable than wealth, a life dedicated to protecting others from the kind of abuse they'd perfected, funded by the very assets they'd tried to steal, and guided by the love of a woman whose faith in me had proven stronger than their attempts to destroy it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.